Today we're diving into one of the most shocking spy stories in Cold War history. A British intelligence officer who betrayed everything, got 42 years in prison, and walked out after 5. This is George Blake. Let's get into it. It's the mid-1950s and the Cold War is at its absolute peak. MI6 and the CIA are facing one massive problem. They can barely get any real intelligence out of the Soviet side. Agents keep disappearing, sources keep drying up. So they come up with something bold. They decide to dig a secret tunnel under East Berlin, almost a kilometer long, packed with equipment to tap directly into Soviet military communications. It takes a full year to build, costs millions of dollars, but when it goes live in 1955, the intelligence starts flowing immediately. Everyone inside MI6 believes this is the greatest operation in the history of the service. What none of them know is that the Soviets already knew about that tunnel before construction even started. They knew the exact location, the exact purpose, every single detail. Because the man who sat in those planning meetings was already secretly working for Moscow. And what makes this completely different from any spy story you've heard? Nobody recruited Blake, nobody blackmailed him. He walked up to a Soviet official one day and just offered himself, for free, no money, belief. And it all started in a North Korean prison camp. George Blake wasn't born British. He was born in Rotterdam in 1922. His father was Jewish, his mother was Dutch. He grew up between the Netherlands and Egypt. Britain was almost a foreign country to him. When the Nazis invaded, he joined the resistance as a teenager. Eventually, he made it to London in 1943. MI6 recruited him almost immediately. He changed his name to George Blake and joined the service. After the war, they sent him to Cambridge to learn Russian, and something quietly started changing in him. He began admiring the Soviet Union, its culture, its sacrifice in the war. But that alone wasn't enough to make him switch sides. Korea did that. In 1950, he was arrested when North Korea captured Seoul. He spent years in captivity. And while he was there, he watched American bombers destroy North Korean towns, civilian areas, entire villages gone. It reminded him of Rotterdam, of what the Germans did to his city when he was a child. He started asking himself one question he couldn't shake. Was he actually on the right side? During a visit from a Soviet official, he slipped him a note. He wanted to cooperate. Nobody forced him, nobody asked. It was completely his own decision. He gets released, flies back to London, and MI6 welcomes him home as a complete hero. Crowds, handshakes, everyone relieved he survived. And the whole time he's already thinking about his first handover for the KGB, shaking their hands with a completely straight face. Back in London with a new posting inside MI6 and a KGB codename of DO Mid, Blake developed a method that was brutally simple. Every single day while his colleagues went out for lunch, he would stay behind at his desk with a small hidden camera on his body and photograph every classified document he could get his hands on. He kept doing this for 8 years straight without anyone noticing. Every 3 weeks, he would meet his KGB handler somewhere completely ordinary, on a bus, in a cinema, on a random London street, and hand over a fresh batch of photographed documents each time. His very first handover alone was enough to destroy MI6's entire wiretapping operation in Vienna, and the KGB immediately understood that this was the real thing. They assigned him a dedicated handler, and Blake quickly became the single most important intelligence asset that Moscow had anywhere in the entire Western world. In 1955, he was transferred to Berlin, and within just 1 month of his arrival, East Germany expelled 500 Western agents, 100 of them British. And somehow throughout all of this, nobody suspected Blake. His official job in Berlin was supposed to be recruiting Soviet officials, but what he was actually doing was feeding Moscow everything he could find, including the complete details of that tunnel operation back at headquarters that everyone was so proud of. The Soviets let the tunnel keep running because shutting it down immediately would trigger an investigation that might lead straight back to Blake. So instead, they simply made sure that nothing truly sensitive ever traveled through those tapped lines. Eventually, they staged a fake accidental discovery during heavy rain, where a Soviet official supposedly stumbled across a suspicious cable, and the British investigated, concluded it was just bad luck, and closed the file. 8 years inside MI6, 5,000 pages of classified documents, hundreds of agents burned before they even reached their destinations. And the only reason any of this ever comes out is one random Polish defector who had no idea what he was actually handing over. In the late 1950s, a senior Polish intelligence officer decided he was done and began working with the CIA. And among the documents he brought over was a list of Polish government officials that British intelligence had identified as potential recruits. The CIA analyst who received that list went completely cold
because sitting in their files from about a year earlier was that exact same list sent by MI6, matching word for word with perfect precision. The only possible explanation was that someone inside MI6 had handed it to the Soviets, who had passed it to the Poles, from where it had just come back around via this defector. There was a mole inside British intelligence, and while they did not yet know who it was, they now knew with certainty that he existed. About a year after that, a second Polish defector gave them a name, and that name was George Blake. MI6 sent Blake a message while he was posted in Lebanon, telling him to come back to London because there was a new assignment waiting for him. Blake immediately suspected it was a trap and contacted his KGB handlers to ask directly whether he had been compromised. They told him no and assured him he was clean and that he should go back. He flew to London and was arrested the moment he arrived. What happened next genuinely shocked everyone in that interrogation room, because Blake simply confessed, voluntarily and completely, without waiting for them to present any evidence. He had not been blackmailed or coerced, and had not been tortured during his time in Korea. He had chosen to work for the KGB himself out of pure ideological conviction, and he told them so openly. The court gave him 42 years, which was the longest sentence handed down in British history outside of a life term, and even the sitting Prime Minister commented publicly that the severity of the sentence was shocking.
42 years. He's 38 when they sentence him, which means he walk out at 80. And from literally day one inside that prison, he starts planning his escape. No KGB coming, just Blake, no printer exchange, no completely ordinary people who thought the sentence was unjust.
Wormwood Scrubs Prison in West London was not the most maximum security facility in Britain, but it was considered more than adequate for the job. Blake spent his days doing yoga and standing on his head every morning, which his cellmates found rather eccentric, but which was not spiritual at all, because he was in his 40s and understood that whatever escape plan he eventually came up with would require him to be in serious physical condition. More importantly, he talked to absolutely everyone, every prisoner on every block, building relationships and looking for the right combination of people with the right motivations. He found 3 of them. Michael Randall and Pat Pottle were political activists serving short sentences for organizing protests near a military base. And after speaking with Blake, they genuinely believed that a 42-year sentence was a profound injustice and wanted to help him. The third man was an Irishman named Sean Burke, who was in for attempted murder of a police officer and whose only motivation for getting involved was, honestly, just that he liked the idea of the adventure. All 3 of them were getting out before Blake, and the moment they were released, active planning began. On the Saturday evening of October 22, 1966, the prisoners and most of the guards were settling in to watch a film when Blake told the officer on his block that he had no interest in movies that night and would stay in his cell and read instead. He waited and then he moved, climbing up to the floor above and slipping through a narrow window that another prisoner had already broken open for him in advance. He crossed the prison yard in darkness, reached the main wall, and then stood there waiting for his accomplices outside to throw a rope ladder over. The time they had agreed on came and went, and nothing appeared. Blake stood against that wall in the rain for a full 40 minutes, knowing that the prisoner head count was coming at any moment. Then finally, the ladder came over the wall. He climbed up, reached the top, and jumped. He landed badly, broke his wrist, and cut his forehead open. But he got up anyway, made it to the waiting car, and they drove away into London. When the guards conducted the count and found the empty cell, the alarm went up immediately, and from cells across the entire prison came the sound of cheering from prisoners who had already known what was coming.
The British government immediately told the press this was a sophisticated KGB operation. Professional agents, careful planning, because that's the only version of this story where they don't look completely humiliated. The real story is so much more embarrassing for them.
For several weeks after the escape, Blake moved between different safe houses across London, while MI6 and Scotland Yard remained convinced that he had already crossed the border and was sitting comfortably in Moscow, not realizing he had never left the city. The 3 accomplices were working on figuring out how to actually get him out of the country, and one idea that received serious consideration was using chemicals to dramatically change the color of his skin so he could be smuggled out on fake documents, though they dropped that plan fairly quickly. What they actually ended up doing was having Michael Randall pack his wife and young child into a minivan for what appeared to be an ordinary family holiday to Berlin, with a hidden compartment built into the back of the vehicle where George Blake would spend the entire drive across Europe. He could not sit up straight, could not stretch out, and had to rely on a plastic bottle for bathroom needs. If they were stopped at any border crossing, Randall and his wife were looking at prison time, and Blake was looking at a life sentence with no possibility of appeal. They were not stopped. Near the East Berlin checkpoint, Blake climbed out of the van, walked over to the East German border guards, and surrendered himself. A few days later, his mother back in England received a letter in the mail with a Moscow postmark. What makes the aftermath particularly remarkable is that British police had worked out exactly who Randall and Pottle were within just a few months of the escape, but then made a completely deliberate decision not to prosecute them. Because putting them on trial in open court would mean the full story coming out publicly, and the full story was that the most destructive spy in British history had been broken out of a London prison not by a sophisticated KGB operation, but by two pacifist political activists and an Irishman who found the whole thing exciting. Randall and Pottle lived as completely free men in Britain for more than 20 years after helping Blake escape until a British newspaper publicly named them in the late 1980s, and suddenly there was no way for the government to avoid putting them on trial. Both men were now in their 50s and facing the very real prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison. They refused to plead guilty, and their defense drew on a legal principle dating back to the 15th century, which held that people who act on genuine moral conviction cannot be held criminally responsible for their actions. The jury acquitted both of them, and they walked out of the courtroom as free men. Blake by that point had been living quietly in Moscow for decades, having changed his name to Georgy Bekter, a Russian version of his original name, Georg Bahar. He had a good apartment, a dacha outside the city, and had married a Russian woman with whom he spent his later years mostly just living quietly at the dacha with their dog, and occasionally consulting for Russian intelligence. He used to meet regularly with Kim Philby, the most famous of the Cambridge Five spies, right up until Philby died in the late 1980s. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Blake worried briefly that the new Russian government might hand him over to Britain, but that never happened, and Russian presidents continued sending him official birthday congratulations until the very end of his life. He died in 2020 at the age of 98, and his biography, published the following year, carries the title, The Happy Traitor. Blake always maintained until his death that he had never betrayed Britain because he was a Jewish kid who had grown up in the Netherlands and Egypt, and the longest continuous period he had ever spent in Britain was those 5 years inside Wormwood Scrubs prison. In one of his last interviews, he said something that has stayed with people ever since, that to betray someone, you must first belong to them, and that he never had.
And that's the story of George Blake. Spy, traitor, or maybe just a man who never belonged anywhere. You decide. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this, subscribe because the next one is even crazier than this. I'll see you there.